It was the year 1994, and I couldn't have been more hyped for Donkey Kong on the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy was this amazing new device that let you play your Game Boy games on the TV, on the big screen, and in color. To me, that was revolutionary. It breathed new life into the games I used to own, and I was beyond excited. But Dad? Dad wasn't exactly thrilled.
The Arcade Classic debuts on your Game Boy. It's Donkey Kong, and it's way better than ever.
This episode is sponsored by Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery. You know, growing up, the best meals were the ones made at home. Whether it was Mom or Dad cooking in the kitchen, or even dinner at Grandma and Grandpa's house, there was just something special about those home-cooked meals.
Fresh green beans.
The smell, the warmth, the way everyone gathered around the table, it felt like love on a plate. And one thing they all had in common? They were always fresh, never frozen. Fast forward to today, and let's be honest, life is busy. That's what makes Factor so incredible. Somehow, in this fast-paced world of 2025, they've found a way to bring back that feeling. Factor delivers fresh, not frozen meals that are chef-crafted and dietitian approved right to your doorstep. No prep, no mess, just real food made with care and ready in 2 minutes. With 35 meals to choose from every week, like keto, protein plus, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and over 60 add-ons like smoothies, snacks, and juices, you've got everything you need to keep that fridge stocked and feel good about what you're eating. Whether you're looking for a comforting lunch or a quick dinner that actually tastes like something Mom might have made, Factor is the modern answer to the traditional home-cooked meal. So here's the deal. Head to Factor75.com and click the link below and use my code 50RetroLife to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50RetroLife at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Bring back the feeling of a good home-cooked meal with none of the work.
Wario Blast!
That's me and my buddy Brian playing Wario Blast on the Super Game Boy.
Was that Wario Blast over?
Yeah, Wario Blast.
Game Boy games? In color? On my TV? No more squinting at a dim green screen, no more batteries, no more bulky accessories, just Game Boy games, right there on our big living room TV.
Super Game Boy for the Super NES. Game Boy games in color, intense.
But we didn't buy the Super Game Boy for Wario Blast. No, this story is about Donkey Kong. You know, for Dad, Donkey Kong wasn't just a video game. It was the video game that made him a gamer. I remember him telling me stories when I was a kid about how in 1981, when Donkey Kong first hit arcades, he was addicted. That game took more quarters out of my dad's pocket than any other arcade game back then.
Mr. Arcade, could you?
Donkey Kong?
Donkey Kong? The official tabletop version.
Frogger, Donkey Kong, and Midway's Pac-Man and Galaxian. The arcade games you can take home with you from Coleco.
By the time I was born in 1986, Nintendo had moved on from Donkey Kong. It was all about Mario and the Nintendo Entertainment System in the late 80s and early 90s. Honestly, guys, we really, growing up, didn't really know much about Donkey Kong. He kind of felt like this old character from the Nintendo vaults that had a couple of NES arcade ports, but really there was nothing new coming out.
Donkey Kong, a Nintendo title, believe it or not, for Atari, because they had licensed it back in 1982 from Nintendo, who at the time was just a developer of software.
Donkey Kong felt like one of those old black and white cartoon characters like Betty Boop or Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a part of Nintendo's history but long since forgotten. Donkey Kong was mainly relegated to cameos. I remember him being in Super Mario Kart, but that's really about it. Nintendo was not showing any love for Donkey Kong in these years. But Nintendo had other plans. In 1994, Donkey Kong came back in a big way on the Game Boy.
All right, son, point out the animal that did this to you.
The beast is back, now with 100 levels of pain. Donkey Kong, new for Game Boy.
By 1993, the Game Boy was really starting to lose steam. It had had a good run from 1989 up until that point, with the likes of Tetris and Super Mario Land, but really, there was nothing exciting coming onto the Game Boy. The Sega Game Gear was really making the Game Boy look bad. I mean, the Game Gear was full color, it had a light on the screen itself was bigger, and Dad and I took notice.
Okay, here we go.
Wow, whoa, I see him.
Dad and I sold our Game Boy and all of the games, and we actually traded up for a Game Gear.
Excellent for Game Gear! Thank you, Maggie.
This made complete sense to us because at the time, it was all about Sega in 1993 and 1994. I mean, Dad and I, we were the Genesis Power Team. It made sense.
The Genesis Power Team!
And for a while, I was a proud Game Gear kid. But deep down, I started to miss the Game Boy. I missed Super Mario Land 2. I missed Ninja Turtles Back from the Sewers. Those were great games.
It's this.
Game Boy?
Yep.
But my dad had no intentions of ever buying a Game Boy again. I remember I would ask him, hey, can we get a Game Boy again? And he always said no, and always cited the fact that he just didn't like the Game Boy, that the Game Gear was so much better. Every now and then I'd ask if we could go and buy a Game Boy again, but every time the answer was no. That all changed with the release of the Super Game Boy in 1994.
Brace yourself. It's Super Game Boy from Nintendo. Play your Game Boy games on the Super NES in living color. Even choose your own color combinations. Play all 350 Game Boy games. How does that strike you? Super Game Boy for the Super NES. Game Boy games in color, intense.
The commercials for the Super Game Boy were amazing. I remember seeing those commercials on TV and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, that is incredible. You mean I can play all the old Game Boy games on my TV in full color? I mean, that was very innovative back then for Nintendo. And what was once a system that was kind of hard to see and play, and you had to find the right light for it, and it was hard to really enjoy those games to the fullest extent. But now with the Super Game Boy, that possibility of playing these games the way the developers really intended you to play them was open. No more need for batteries or accessories like the Light Boy or those magnifier lenses.
Take one of your Game Boy game packs, and that's easy because there's over 350 different titles. Then you insert that into the Super Game Boy cartridge. That looks like a Super NES game pack, but with special adapter electronics inside. You put the Super Game Boy accessory directly into the Super NES system, like so, and you play your awesome Game Boy games in color on your TV.
And Donkey Kong was leading the charge.
It's Donkey Kong, and it's way better than ever. Challenge the same tough levels, then take it a step further and hit the big city. Kong snagged Pauline again, and you gotta get her back, dude.
Dad and I were browsing the electronics department at our local Service Merchandise. Yeah, you remember that place? Not a lot of people these days do. You had to be around in that era.
Service merchandise. One trip. Done.
And there it was. At the end of the aisle, a Super Game Boy kiosk showcasing Donkey Kong. I remember there was nobody in line at the Donkey Kong Super Game Boy kiosk, and so I had full dominion over this kiosk, and I had so much fun playing those initial stages of Donkey Kong. This was my first hands-on time with the brand new Super Game Boy and the brand new Donkey Kong game. I played through those first 4 stages, and I remember thinking, is this it? Is this all there's going to be? I mean, is this just a port of the Donkey Kong arcade game and it's going to loop and repeat? I mean, that's fine. It plays well. It's really nice. But everything changed when I beat the 4th stage, where it normally is supposed to be the end of the arcade game, and normally you'd see a game over screen. All of a sudden, the game continues, and Donkey Kong gets up and steals Pauline once again, and you're off into a brand new adventure with an actual hub map screen where you go from level to level that more closely resembled modern games of the time. I mean, this felt huge, and really the gameplay totally changed at that point into more of a puzzle platformer with elements from the original Donkey Kong arcade game. It felt like a true new sequel to Donkey Kong. Whereas in the past we had Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong Math, this was the real deal. This felt like a true sequel. I was so blown away by the game that I actually remember waving Dad over, signaling to him and saying, "You got to check this out. Come check this out." And he comes over, and he might have had some sort of item from service merchandise that he was looking at in his hands, and he's sort of half paying attention because he really wasn't into the Game Boy. He wasn't into this whole thing, but he was willing to check it out, of course. And so I start showing him Donkey Kong on the Super Game Boy. Initially, he's just kind of like, "Oh, okay, yeah." He had no intention of buying a Super Game Boy and Donkey Kong on this day. And really, he had no intention of ever going back to the Game Boy.
Game Boy?
The Game Boy, in his mind, was something that we had left behind. But I wasn't willing to give up. I kept going. I kept playing through those opening stages because I knew if I could just get to the point where the game changes and opens up into a brand new game, a whole new world, he might be convinced. I remember I had to turn on the salesman charm with my dad because he still was kind of on the fence about buying Game Boy again. It felt like we were rebuying something that we had sold before. And so I had to convince him in the store that day at Service Merchandise that it was worth buying a Super Game Boy. I remember telling him we can play Game Boy games on the TV and they'll be in color.
You can choose from 9 different border frames which surround the game screen. The borders even animate.
Despite me giving the best sales pitch of my life at that point, Dad still really wasn't on board. You can tell this was not a product he really wanted to get that day, or any day. But after I beat that 4th stage in front of Dad and Donkey Kong gets up and the game continues into this big new adventure, I could tell Dad was excited, and Dad decided, okay, let's get a Super Game Boy. And before I knew it, the brand new Super Game Boy with Donkey Kong was mine.
Super Game Boy.
I truly loved that Donkey Kong game, which we would go on to lovingly call Donkey Kong 94. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy would later be recognized as one of the key titles that helped save the original Game Boy, extending its life and reminding people just how good Nintendo's little handheld could be. Dad really didn't want to buy the Super Game Boy. to him, it felt like throwing money at something we had already left behind, like buying the Game Boy all over again. He was skeptical, really skeptical, and honestly, I don't blame him. But something changed that day at Service Merchandise. When I showed him Donkey Kong running on the Super Game Boy, I think it may have rekindled old feelings he had for the original Donkey Kong arcade game. And maybe when he saw me light up the way I did, he gave it a chance. And once we brought that Super Game Boy home, something even cooler happened.
Mario Blast! Thank you very much.
Dad started to love it. He embraced playing those old Game Boy games again, but now on the TV, in color, with borders and enhancements.
Oh, you can take your number around. Let's do 8.
Was that Mario Blast?
Yeah, Mario Blast.
It was like rediscovering a lost library of classics. And together, we started building up a new collection, right there on the Super Nintendo. When I think back to 1994, I think about how Donkey Kong, it was his greatest year. And one of mine, too.
And it is. It's not new shoes. It's Donkey Kong Country! Yeah!
Between Donkey Kong on the Game Boy and Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, Nintendo didn't just revitalize a character. They revitalized their entire legacy.
No!
Donkey Kong Country!
Oh my god.
Donkey Kong!
Donkey Doo?
Donkey Kong helped save the Game Boy, the Super Nintendo, and maybe Nintendo itself. So, which Donkey Kong game from 1994 do you remember most? Was it the Game Boy game that launched the Super Game Boy? Or was it the 1994 Christmas classic Donkey Kong Country, which looked like a 32-bit game on a 16-bit platform? I want to know in the comments below. Definitely let me know. And if this is your first time to the channel, do consider subscribing. I love talking about my game crazy family and all the amazing adventures we had with video games, so many of which were caught on tape by Dad. Also, big thanks to our patrons over on Patreon and YouTube memberships. If you like this content and want to help support the channel, we greatly appreciate it. That's it, guys. Catch you next time.